te zetten. Ietsje luider, ja. Ietsje luider. Ietsje luider. Hoor je niet? Ik hoor je niet. Hallo? Hallo? Ietsje luider. Oké. Nou, dan gaan we het zo doen. Dames en heren, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Mart, welcome to you. And we are very glad that you have a nice day.
Thank you. So today we're doing the second part of the two seminars that there is a sound. Let me first see if I can stop this. Yeah, it was that computer. We start again. Okay. There we go. All right. Part two of the second installment where Mart Radio invites us to come and give the class here. So we're thankful for their hospitality. On Monday, we dealt with thinkers that were from the Caribbean, Great Britain, Germany, Paul Gilroy, and we dealt with a thinker from Cameroon, Achille Mbembe. Today, we're going to deal with two thinkers from the United States of America, or at least they're stationed there for now, but they too are moving scholars. Wilderson and Adolf Reed Jr. So I'm going to start with this photo. Who can tell me who this woman is? Yes. I don't think I can hear you. Can you explain to us who Candace Owens is?
She's like a conservative talking piece. She's on a lot of like political shows. She kind of gives her opinion as conservative black women.
Yes. So Candace Owens worked for Donald Trump. She is a staunch, she's against Black Lives Matter, completely against Black Lives Matter. And her opinion is that Black Lives Matter does not help African Americans. She says what Black Lives Matter is a leftist, communist movement. And as far as the development of African Americans are concerned, that development is only possible if the African Americans participate with the Republican Party and take on capitalism. That's her argument. It's just one person. I'm showing you different points of view. Part two. I think the persons in the Netherlands will know who this person is. Yes. Sylvana Simons. How would you classify or characterize Sylvana Simons and her politics? Yes? Correct. Yeah. She's a leftist, or many people would characterize as leftist, intersectional, so intersectional feminist. Some people would even say a bit Marxist, and she is a proponent of Black Lives Matter. Third one. Who knows who this is? Yes.
My name is Alexandra, and she is a congresswoman from Scotland, and she is very left-oriented and very much active in her community and very outspoken also in media in social injustice in the US.
Yeah, correct. So this is a an activist politician, similar to Sylvana Simons here in the Netherlands, and quite a proponent also of BLM, Black Lives Matter. Now we go to the person that we are reading today, or that you read today, Frank B. Wilderson. Who do you think Frank B. Wilderson would agree with, having read the article? Would it be Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez? Would it be Sylvana Simons? Or would it be Candace Owens? Yes. What's the critique on Marxism?
I think the most wait, yeah. Is Black Lives Matter? Wait, I just and then we wouldn't agree with Candace Owens because she's a very conservative. And the last one is I think it's I mean she also focuses on Black Lives Matter, but I think it's maybe would have a more Marxist standpoint and maybe more focused on labor as the point of inequality than as race for Black.
Yes, so for the persons who are at home, what you're saying, I'm going to translate because there are people listening on the radio. You're saying that you believe that he would not agree so much with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. Generally speaking, maybe her where she sides with Black Lives Matter, yes, not with the Marxism. With Sylvana Simons, he would agree a bit more, and with Candace Owens, not at all. Here's what I think. Before we go to that, Frank B. Wilderson, there is a paradigm in the United States of America, or came out of the United States of America. You find it all over now, and it's called Afro-pessimism. And Frank B. Wilderson is the major component or proponent of that particular theoretical paradigm. These are some books he wrote, and the last book is entitled Afro-Pessimism, and that book is selling by the thousands. It's one of the few times that an academic book sells outside of academia. He's influenced by a set of thinkers, or at least he tries enslaved were socially dead. And socially dead meant that there were a group of people who were in a society but did not belong to that society and could never belong to that society. So they experienced natal alienation, as it's called. They alienated from the place of their birth. Secondly, they're generally dishonored. So anyone can dishonor them. And thirdly, he would say they experience gratuitous violence. That means they can just be violated for no reason. That is what slavery is, according to Orlando Patterson. So it's always those three things. The people are in a community and they have no rights in that community they're living. Secondly, they're just dishonored across the board. And thirdly, they just experience violence whenever someone sees fit to actually inflict violence on them. Who's going to build on that? Who's going to build on Horton's pillars and her conceptions of gender, whereby she says, she has an article called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, because it was the father, the white father, who determined who would be considered legitimate or not. Thirdly, he's going to build on Saidiya Hartman, and Saidiya Hartman spoke about the lingering effects of slavery, that it remains, but we cannot say we are post-slavery. So Frank Davidson is going to build on these three thinkers primarily. And I gave you the first three intellectuals, politicians, Silvana Simons, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Candace Owens. And I asked you, who do you think Frank Davidson would agree with? And here are the people he has a beef with. Anything that reaches to Marxism, he says, that is not sufficient. That doesn't work. So Afro-pessimism as a paradigm, it is trying to contest Marxism. And it is also contesting feminism. We're not going to talk about that today, but it's also contesting feminism. And we're going to explain exactly why it contests Marxism, and later on in the Q&A, we can talk about why Afro-pessimism considers itself a paradigm that is being a school of thought that also contests feminism. This is a quote, and you would definitely not agree with this quote. We are trained Marxists. We are supervised on sort of ideological theories. And I think that what we really try to do is build a movement that could be utilized by many, many black folk. This quote, stating we are Marxists, is from the author of this book. When they call you a terrorist, when they call you a terrorist. And it's written by one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. So the founders of Black Lives Matter, two of them, Alicia Garza and Patrice Cullors, they consider themselves Marxists. And in all of their writings, writings and interviews, they say so. Patrice Cullors, myself, and Alicia Garza in particular, we are trained organizers, we are trained Marxists. When you look at Alicia Garza, she talks about Black Lives Matter is not possible under capitalism. She has to abolish capitalism. So while Frank Davidson's Afro-pessimism says Marxism is not sufficient, it can't be the dominant paradigm, the founders of Black Lives Matter say differently. They consider themselves Marxists, and they consider their movement a Marxist movement. Here's the response of Wilderson. I've just taken some parts of the article that she read, the most important parts. He says, the United States of America must come to grips with the limitations of Marxism, the limitations of Marxist discourse in the face of the black subject being black people, being African Americans. And why? Because his argument is that the United States is constructed at the intersection of two important systems. One important system is capitalism, and the other important system is white supremacy. And he would say the privileged subject of Marxist discourse is a subaltern, and subaltern only means someone who is oppressed. And they approach the subaltern, the ones oppressed, through the variable of wage, which means labor, work. And in that, they would say, Marxist in his argument would say, that means that racism is secondary. Labor is primary. It's right, in other words, Marxism assumes a subaltern structured by capital. Capital is the social relations of labor, not by white supremacy. In this scenario, racism is right off the base, as if it were being derivative of political economy, so therefore it's secondary. He does not agree with that. Now you would ask, who is the subaltern structured by capital? And he says that subaltern is not the black subject. And he says Marxism is limited. And if you pay attention, what he's doing is he is actually using a basic element of all Marxist discourse. All Marxist discourse says are not being paid an adequate wage. If they're paid an adequate wage, then work is not a problem. So its desire is to democratize work. And by democratizing work, which is Augustin's argument, he would say it remains within European Enlightenment thought and Reformation thought, Protestant thought, where you are important if you work, where it's about progress, where it's about production and so forth. This, he would say, is the dominant figure in Marxism. And this, he would say, is the Marxist dynamic. And we'll finish and we'll go and see what we think about and how and if we wish to critique it. He's going to say what Marxism does is that it presupposes, remember we spoke about Gramsci in the first class when we talked about the different kind of intellectuals, the organic intellectual, the vernacular intellectual, the traditional intellectual. He would say Marxism seeks to dominate the field, and in dominating the field, what it does is it says everyone is a Marxist intellectual that is radical. So you will have Chinese organic intellectuals, Indian organic intellectuals, African organic intellectuals, and you name it. And all intellectuals in Marxism, he would say, always talk about class. Class must come first and then race. Now the question. We all know that many African Americans, most are workers. Many are working class. And he would say black people, so African Americans, are not workers. Why not? Because he said they were never meant to be workers in the US. Let me read this for you. The fact that millions upon millions of black people work misses the point. So if you tell him, that's nonsense, Wilderson, because black people are workers, he will say, yes, many work, but you're missing the point. What is the point? The point is that they were never meant to be workers. So what were they meant to be? He And interestingly, all of you read the article, to make that argument, he leaves the U.S. and he goes to South Africa. South Africa in the early days of colonialism, around the 1500s, the 1700s. And he's going to say, and he's going to use a South African author, Coetzee, and he's going to build on the work of Coetzee. What's Coetzee's argument? Coetzee will say, when the Europeans entered South Africa and colonized South Africa, they met two groups of people there. They met the Xhosa, the Zulus and so forth, and they met the Khoisan. Those are the two groups of people that met there. When the project of colonization happened, according to Wilderson, according to Coetzee, he's building on Coetzee's argument, Coetzee would say, when colonialism happens and violence happens, it always is accompanied by a narrative, a discourse. So it has to make sense. Violence always must make sense. You oppress, but you must be able to legitimate it. And entering South Africa, according to Coetzee, when they met the Xhosa people, they could say in the discourse, they have religion, but their religion is inferior to ours. They have customs, the Xhosa, but their customs is inferior to ours. They have agriculture. It's a different kind of agriculture. They have religion, but it's a different kind of religion, and so they're creating the hierarchy. It makes sense. Coetzee will say, yes, it made sense for the Xhosa, Bantu peoples. They could not make sense of the Khoisan. Why? Because the Khoisan did not have anything they had. When they asked the Khoisan about their religion, the Khoisan did not have a religion. They cared nothing about whether it was God or not. They were not agriculturalists. The Khoisan are people that we would call nowadays, it's one term, it was called hunters and gatherers, the band societies. That was what the Khoisan were in South Africa. So as he writes, Africans like the Xhosa, who were agriculturalists, provided European discourse with enough anthropological categories because they said these are humans, they might be inferior. Remember, those who took the class today or 2 weeks ago on evolutionism, they are inferior. So anthropologically, you could put them as inferior, but it provided categories to make sense. So they could be known through the text, but not the Khoisan. They did not produce the categories to be known. This is a quote. Those Europeans who encountered the Khoisan during this period, the 1500s to the 1700s, came face to face with an anthropological scandal. A being without recognizable customs, religion, medicine, dietary patterns, culinary habits, sexual mores, means of agriculture, and most significantly, without character. Character because, according to the literature, they did not work. Khoisan did not work. Even when press ganged into service by the whip, from the Bible, by the specter of starvation, they showed no valuation in this world. The only remedy for the condition, according to one cave writer, was therapy, just white people. They could not make sense of the Khoisan. According to Khoisan, they could make sense of the Zulus and other people, but this group they could make sense. Did not have the capital. And remember Coetzee saying, whenever you have colonialism, you have a machinery that makes sense of it. It must make sense. If it can't make sense, you have a scandal. That's what it says. Made us out that there's two axes. There's a historical axis that making sense of what Coetzee. The historical axis. Where are they in the line of this? This is evolutionism. Europe is supposedly there. The Bantus are probably there. Where are the Indians? They're there. Where are the Chinese? They're there. But they must have categories for you to trace themselves. Since the person is not interested, whether it's a girl or not, that is not a question. Since they were not interested in actually making money, having agriculture, having empires, and so on, no place there. They could not tell you when someone dies, this is how we go. Another factor. So the anthropological axis, which is the second axis, is what are the customs, culture, ways of life, etc. You couldn't place them in the anthropological axis, and historically they didn't make sense. They say when they meet such a group of people, there are limits. That is outside of any society that they can make sense of. And of course, like those principal categories and other principal categories now are categories to understand to understand what's going on. Like the principal categories, dress, diet, medicine, crafts, physical appearance, and most importantly, work. The course has said the use of organization to pick that under the category according to this person. She was born into these categories. And the worst thing was they were designated idleness. Idleness has been found in most people. And I don't have to when it goes to Marxism. Remember, for Marxism, work is central. So you make a group of people who work is awesome. That group of people, the feminist movement, they consider that group of people as scattered. Thus, the Khoisan start with the discourse with non-established opponents. Students were opponents. After the middle. Government representatives sat at the Khoisan for the speak to and have a relationship with them. But their status was unspeakable status. So-called people without culture. Just as he does in the job. That's what he does. It's excellent. It says, argument explains what it says. Talking about Khoisan and Khoisan, he's going to say, that helps us explain why
Amazing.
Americans cannot claim a narrative of arrival because they were never migrants. So he's going to say, these are the axes: entitlement, sovereignty, belonging to a sovereign nation, and immigration. And his argument is that the black American subject does not generate the historical categories of entitlement, sovereignty, and immigration. Both of these, they are both directly. The black and generating demands of the historical axis will present a virtual blank, much like the poor sense virtual blank presented to the black and generating demands of the anthropological axis. So what is new? You take the person, extend the person, and everything. What the Khoisan experience in South Africa, it's the same experience with the African Americans in the US. With the Khoisan, they didn't have the anthropological categories. With the African Americans, they can't be part of the US because they don't have the historical categories: entitlement, immigration, sovereignty. Coming to the end, and then we'll talk about it. So as a result, African Americans are a scandal, like the Khoisan were a scandal, in relation to the historical axis. His argument in other places is that the distinction you have to make, remember Marxism makes a distinction between workers and the oppressed. Some of feminism makes a distinction and would say patriarchy is the important thing, male, female. Afro-pessimism of Frank B. Wilderson makes a distinction that says human, slave. That's the dominating category. The slave is that which cannot be part of the society. It's outside of it. It's the scandal. That's his distinction. That explains why he would say African Americans are not a constituent category of the U.S. And he sometimes goes further in other analytical Europe where he says blacks are not a constituent category of humanity. Last one, the grandmother in the U.S. is that constant reminder that not only can work not be reformed, but it cannot be transformed to accommodate all subjects. Work is a right category. This is his theory. Let's talk about it. What do we think of this?
That's an interesting approach. I thought in New York City during the Black Lives Matter protests and stuff, and from what I understood it was, we have to, because I'm not American, but I guess that we have to fight for them to recognize us as, Wilderson says, you can fight as much as you want, you will never be seen as a part of America. Which I think is very interesting. Because it basically counts also on the African Americans, like, you will never be part of anything, and you need to come to terms with that. So he doesn't provide like an alternative, which I think is also troubling because I've like I also explained to myself, like, in Germany, I'm not part of Germany because I'm like people don't believe that I can be German. Like with African Americans, what I know because they are not going to be welcomed in Africa as they consider their Muslim party, and they are not welcomed in America. Like, what are they going to do? What is the consequence thing? Why would they go from here? And I think all this needs to provide some, you can't just be a pessimist. Like, okay, we have the pessimist aspect, but like, where do we go from here? Like, what can we do with Marxism? Elevate ourselves. couple, especially with the points on how to be an American, things that you have to have. I think these are, if you look at it, really three things that they are missing. And also African Americans, they partly don't want to be only Americans, they want to be African Americans. So they also partly give up part of that claim to be only American, or to be accepted only as American.
About this baby, Afro-Descent.
I think it's interesting that he kind of died with the like subject can never be accepted or never be part of like a white society citizen, and this movement gives the authority in a way to a white society, because then the subject just exists in relation to the white society. If I get that right, I kind of like, is there maybe a way of being a direct way for the system? Should I just kind of like deconstruct this background, so to say, between those two societies, but between those societies that can be part of, like, is there a way that you can maybe find labels and then the problem is that you can't provide more because of the benefit of those companies. That makes sense. It's something that we criticize as the capitalistic aspect, which is a very European concept, which Kennedy wrote 200 years ago, and he says that the capitalistic concept is the right category because that's why the right body really have to transform the way we define work. And who, I think he says work, but I feel like he has a much broader way what he means by that, and I think it's more like a capitalistic criticism he's offering here and saying that under this concept derived from Europeans, it cannot work for others. So I think
I think that when I was reading Wilderson, something that kept like popping up for me was the fact that he was referring to African Americans as slaves, as in present tense, and I don't think that's something that I relate to or like anyone else I know relates to. So I think that my biggest critique of him would be his like inability to, I guess, move on or like evolve to the new ways in which Black Americans experience the world. Like, we're not slaves anymore, and it doesn't seem he's able to make that shift. Like, I agree with some of the points he makes about like the inability of like Black Americans to fully integrate into society, but I think that standpoint is a bit antiquated.
So you inspired me for this because we were talking about new groups, and that's where Black nationalism comes in. And I think the fact he's calling Black Americans or African Americans slaves isn't really as a form as a slave, how we know it in historical context, but more as how the society, like how the system of the U.S. is built, the whole credit system, the educational system. That's how like Black or African Americans don't really participate, not because they're just for like on themselves, but it's exactly the empowerment. Where is the power to participate, and who's the gatekeeper? And this form, like how the system is built, it's it's it feels like for me it feels like the system is the gatekeeper and is built by European white standards, and that's why African Americans are not considered as participants.
There are certain tricks in this article, and we should relate it to what we had last week, or not last week, Monday, or Gilroy's Black and White, or Achille Mbembe's. But internal critique to the piece is the trick that Wilderson does, and it's well executed while writing. He speaks about an anthropological axis and a historical axis. Right? He claims the Khoisan anthropologically didn't have the categories, and therefore historically they were out of the picture. So historically and anthropologically they were a scandal in his categories. But when it comes to the African Americans, he only speaks about the historical axis. You see the trick? He says nothing about the anthropological axes in the article. He doesn't speak about the cultural expressions, none of that. That supposedly, if you want to make sense, if you're, let's say, the dominating power, it has to have those categories. Now, the African Americans have all of these categories. In writing the article, he writes in such a way that you completely forget them. And you're taken along in his argument. Yeah.
Why do you think why did he do that in the article? I feel like he ignored it just to make his point, but why did he ignore the anthropological axis?
That is a very good question. Why would he do so? Because Afro-pessimists, not Orlando Patterson but the others, they don't want the quick move to say, and now it's okay. Since they don't want that quick move to say, now it's okay in the US, the discourse is a discourse that continuously remembers of the things that are going bad. So they want a pessimistic attitude. They don't want people to fall asleep in a slumber and say, we're fine. Now, one way of doing so is to obfuscate, occlude certain things in such a way that then people say, shit, man, there's something wrong. I must be angry. Wilderson would say anger is a much more productive emotion than complacency, than feeling satisfied. So that's the trick in his discourse. If you take Gilroy, what would be the trick that Gilroy would say, this can't work? Yeah.
I'm not sure if he said it, but I remember that in an article somewhere it said you have to be careful not to fall into anger or into like self-hate and self-annihilation. You have to try to keep yourself together, because if you get into this anger too much, you will lose yourself and you will not be helpful to the cause. You will just be angry, and from angriness nothing will change, and from angriness nothing will we don't have the right mindset to think differently and think in a way to elevate yourself. I don't know if that was Gilroy, but I remember reading it somewhere.
it is an important liberal point. Yes.
So after reading Gilroy's article or the interview, I listened to a podcast about him, and in that podcast they talked about his reaction to Afro-pessimism, and I thought it might be a good addition to read that because I wrote it down. Gilroy sees it as an ontological turn in which race becomes an unassailable barrier between the self and the world, and anti-black violence an immutable fact. It absolves you of having to do anything at all, and that's what I think personally also feel with Afro-pessimism. I wonder, what do the people that are following this theory, what do they obtain from it, from thinking this way?
That's a good question. We're going to try and answer the question. Take those things that you said from Gilroy, or that interview with Gilroy, that he says it can't change. That's the way it's immutable. It is so forever. Afro-pessimists like Frank B. Wilderson, Jared Sexton, Zakiya, Imani Jackson, and so forth, they would say what they want is the end of the world. They don't want reform, they just want it gone. That's their argument. So just destroy the system as it is, fully, not a little bit. That's their argument for it. Gilroy would say, remember the Black Atlantic? He would say, these categories that you're talking about, they came about because of the interaction of peoples. There is no history that is only European. There's a history that is made between all the peoples coming from Africa, Asia, the Amerindians, the people coming from Africa, from Europe. Together they are making these things. They're making the world. So when you try to look at cultural categories belonging to groups, there you're making a category mistake. That's where Gilroy would think it different. So remember the example we gave of the fufu? So Gilroy would say, when the Europeans are entering South Africa, they've been in the Americas a long time. Their categories are created through that interaction. Yucca, what many West Africans and others eat, is a crop from South America brought to Africa, becomes the dominant crop, dominant way of people eating their food in West Africa. But it's not only the foods that come in, it's also ideas. Therefore, you do not find so-called pure cultures. Nowhere. That's Gilroy's argument. So he would say, Wilderson is making a purist argument. There's such a thing as a pure European and a pure Khoisan and a pure Xhosa. He would say that's not possible. There's borrowings continuously. And remember, he said, one of modernity's categories is to think in pure groups. Prior to modernity, no one thinks that way. Last question, and then we'll take a break. Yeah.
So it's a question. I wondered already on Monday how Gilroy makes sense of violence, because I feel like, of course, there's interaction, but how do you make sense of the power that is like in place when people interact with each other? Because I feel like, and that's kind of creates violence, or violence creates power. I don't know which way around, but I would say he doesn't really, well, I didn't really recognize him talking about it, and I feel like that's a very important point when looking maybe also at inequalities.
Good point. Very good point. In, I think, the interview and in other works, he says this thing didn't happen only in harmony. It happened in strife. There was genocide, like in the, I think the quote of one of the slides of the PowerPoint. In venture, African enslavement, genocide, all of this went into the mix. But all of it contributed. So it includes, it's in it. It's sometimes that these groups perhaps engaged positively, but they struggled, they fought, they learned from each other, and so forth. And that made made the modern world. We'll take a break, 10 minutes, then we start again.
Zoveel niggas in de rij stond voor je. Laat met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was nodig. Jij weet dat ik jou niet meer wil behouden. Jij deed dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je. En vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was nodig. Ik ben nu dan. Single life, die gaat nu on en on en on en on. Yeah, low life, low key, goodbye, homie. Yeah, achteraf was spijt en ik weet dat je nu twijfelt. Al je homies zeggen, ga je zeggen, ben met wifey. Ze hebben niks te maken met je problems, nigga, bye. Nigga, bye. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je. En vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was loyal hadden. Kijk niet, praat niet, baby. Zet jou nu aan hobby. Vind je het raar dat ik verder ga, you blame me? Maar sta nu niet zo verwarrend, is het niet. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Hold on. Weet je bijna nu hoe het zit toch? Ze mag je hebben, ik heb niks meer te missen. Je weet niet wat je nu voorbij laat gaan. Zoveel niggas in de rij stond voor je. Ik met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was nodig. Jij weet dat ik jou niet meer wil behouden. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal.
Hallo, jullie kosten? Hallo. Hallo, hallo. 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 Nu zit het geluid goed. Verbetering is gekomen.
baby. Zet jou nu aan hold me. Vind je het raar dat ik verder ga, you hate me. We staan nu iets over en is het niet. Jij deed weg, dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Hold on. Weet je bijna nu hoe het zit toch? Zo mag je hebben, ik heb niks meer te missen. Je weet niet wat je nu voorbij laat gaan. Zoveel negers in de rij, je stond vooraan. Ik was met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was loyal. Jij weet dat ik jou niet meer wil behouden. Jij deed mij dus, ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus, ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was loyal. Ik ben niet dan. Single life, die gaat nu on en on en on en on. Yeah, low life, low key. Goodbye, homie. Yeah, achteraf was spijt en ik weet dat je nu twijfelt. Call je homies, dan ga je zeggen, ik ben met wifey. Ze hebben niks te maken met je problems, nigga, bye. Nigga, bye. Jij deed mij dus, ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus, ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was loyal. Kijk niet, praat niet, baby. Zet jou nu aan hold me. Vind je het raar dat ik verder ga, you hate me. We staan nu iets over en is het niet. Jij deed weg, dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Hold on. Weet je bijna nu hoe het zit toch? Zo mag je hebben, ik heb niks meer te missen. Je weet niet wat je nu voorbij laat gaan. Zoveel negers in de rij, je stond vooraan. Ik was met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was loyal. Jij weet dat ik jou niet meer wil behouden. Jij deed mij dus, ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus, ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was loyal. Ik ben niet dan. Single life, die gaat nu on en on en on en on. Yeah, low life, low key. Goodbye, homie. Yeah, achteraf was spijt en ik weet dat je nu twijfelt. Call je homies, dan ga je zeggen, ik ben met wifey. Ze hebben niks te maken met je problems, nigga, bye. Nigga, bye. Jij deed mij dus, ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus, ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was loyal. baby. Zit jou nu aan hobby? Vind je het raar dat ik verder ga, you baby? We staan nu iets over, het is het niet. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Hold on. Weet bijna nu hoe het zit toch? Ze mag je hebben, ik heb niks meer te missen. Je weet niet wat je nu voorbij laat gaan. Zoveel was loyal, jij weet dat ik jou niet meer wil behouden. Jij bent dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je. En vaak fokte jij. En alsof jij het niet. Was ik ben niet dan. Single life die gaat nu on en on en on en on. Yeah, low life, low key. Goodbye, homie. Achteraf was spijt en ik weet dat je nu twijfelt. Al je homies zelfs, dan ga je zeggen ik ben met wifey. Ze hebben niks te maken met je problems, nigga, bye. Nigga, bye. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je en vaak fokte jij. Niet alsof jij het niet. Was loyal hadden. Kijk niet, praat niet, baby. Zit jou nu aan hobby? Vind je het raar dat ik verder ga, you baby? We staan nu iets over, het is het niet. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Hold on. Weet je bijna nu hoe het zit toch? Ze mag je hebben, ik heb niks meer te missen. Je weet niet wat je nu voorbij laat gaan. Zoveel niggas in de rij, stond vooraan. Ik was met je, en vaak fokte jij. En alsof jij het niet. Ik was loyal, jij weet dat ik jou niet meer wil behouden. Jij bent dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je en vaak fokte jij. En alsof jij het niet. Was loyal. Ik ben niet dan. Single life die gaat nu on en on en on en on. Yeah, low life, low key. Goodbye, homie. Achteraf was spijt en ik weet dat je nu twijfelt. Al je homies zelfs, dan ga je zeggen ik ben met wifey. Ze hebben niks te maken met je problems, nigga, bye. Nigga, bye. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je en vaak fokte jij. Niet alsof jij het niet. Was loyal hadden. baby. Zit jou nu al op? Vind je het raar dat ik verder ga, you hate me? We staan nu niet zo voor en het is het niet. Jij deed weg, dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Hold on. Weet je bijna nu hoe het zit toch? Zo mag je hebben, ik heb niks meer te missen. Je weet niet wat je nu voorbij laat gaan. Zoveel niggas in de rij, stond vooraan. Laat met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was behouden. Jij weet dat ik jou niet meer wil behouden. Jij bent dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je. En vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was behouden. Ik ben niet dan. Single life, die gaat nu on en on en on en on. Yeah, low life, low key. Goodbye, homie. Yeah, achteraf was spijt en ik weet dat je nu twijfelt. Kan je homies zeggen, ga je zeggen, ik ben met wifey. Ze hebben niks te maken met je problems, nigga, bye. Nigga, bye. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Ik was in love met je. En vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was behouden. Kijk niet, praat niet, baby. Zet jou nu al op. Vind je het raar dat ik verder ga, you hate me? We staan nu niet zo voor en het is het niet. Jij deed weg, dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me. Tijd kost geld en je wist het allemaal. Hold on. Weet je bijna nu hoe het zit toch? Zo mag je hebben, ik heb niks meer te missen. Je weet niet wat je nu voorbij laat gaan. Zoveel niggas in de rij, stond vooraan. Love met je, en vaak fokte jij. Net alsof jij het niet was behouden. Jij weet dat ik jou niet meer wil behouden. Jij deed mij dus ik deed jou vies. Don't put your arms around me.
Now that everyone has something to eat, everyone is satisfied or getting themselves satisfied, we are going to continue. Part 2. And interestingly, what I gave you to read, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Interestingly, the 2 articles I gave you are counterpoints. So Wilderson is part of the Afro-pessimist paradigm, and Adolf Reed is part of the Marxist paradigm. Both perspectives. So we ended, yes? Hello? Yes? Yeah? Okay. Yes, you can ask your question.
So within the Marxist paradigm, there is an idea of how you should have an ideal society. And I get that the Afro-pessimism thought has a critique on the Marxist thought because it sets labor first and not as race comes secondary. But that's the only thing, right? The Afro-pessimism has the critique on the Marxist theory and the Marxist thought, and it doesn't offer any other way how to design a society or how to it just says we don't
solution. They think offering a solution is something they believe which is laziness, and they think that, or Jared Saxton perhaps even more. Jared Saxton is the other famous Afro-pessimist. He would say this is an Anglo-Saxon hang-up. In America, Great Britain, they like science which directly offers a solution. Whilst he says the French and what Afro-pessimists are doing, they can actually be busy with an analysis without saying, and this is how you thinking. And he's going to say these people are not radical at all. What they are part of the professional managerial class, he calls them. Professional managerial in the sense that they actually have university degrees, they have fairly good jobs, they can go on vacation at least once or twice a year, and so forth. Its adherents, he would say, are not concerned with trying to generate a large, broad political base, need to pursue a transformative agenda, but they are committed to racial parity within neoliberalism. Racial parity is something like the racial settlement. I want the different ethnicities, people who belong to different ethnicities, ethno-racial categories, to have equal rights in that, but not all of them, he would say, representatives of all of them. So his argument is that identity politics is about that. He would say what we are trying to do at the university, diversity and inclusion, is actually about the professional managerial class and their children, that they will get the positions of authority, not the masses. And he says when you make a fissure between the white working class and all other working classes, and you call them a particular category, then you can't have a broad base to create a transformative agenda, because the vast majority was always going to be working class. So again, like Adolf Reed, he's a Marxist. Like Adolf Reed, he's a thinker from the US, but like Adolf Reed, and this is interesting, Adolf Reed and Frank B. Wilderson, both their mothers and fathers were PhD holders. So these are representatives of a class of intellectuals that have been there for a while. Adolf Reed Jr. from his father, Adolf Reed, who was a famous political scientist. Frank B. Wilderson's parents were psychologists and others. These are kids who grew up with wealth, comfort. They are not first generation, like many of you are first generation. These are second to third generation academics. Remember Bell's point? He would say, all these people who say nothing has changed, nothing is going to change, you forget where they are in the social ladder. Frank B. Wilderson has one of the best jobs at one of the best universities in the US. So when they write that nothing has changed, he would say, I can also write that nothing has changed, but that doesn't make sense, because look at where I am, where my parents were, and see how America is indeed in some kind of a transformation. And his argument is what kind of a transformation, and that's where you have to issue the critique. So he would say, whenever people say nothing has changed, we're still slaves, he would say it's rhetorical. It can't be real, because the ones who are saying it are actually the ones who are giving you a grade. If they have the possibility of giving you a grade, then you should know that this argument can't hold, for them at least. We'll talk about and discuss his arguments after we've presented all of it. Why is it dangerous? And there's two ways of explaining it. He says when you use a generic category, and generic simply means a broad category like white supremacy, or primarily white supremacy he's talking about here, then he says you can't actually fix anything, because you're not looking specifically at what is the problem at hand that you really want to fix. All you say is, I see something and it's white supremacy. So if you say there's continuity, you can't see specificity anymore. And he wants to see the specificity, and he says that specific thing is what you have to tackle. Because if you understand it in a time and place, so let's say if you're looking at a city, I don't know, name a city, Kansas City, in a particular neighborhood, then you have to understand what is going on there, really empirically, to be able to solve it there. But if you use the big generic trans-historical category of white supremacy, he would say you're not solving anything. So for him, it's ineffective politically, and it is scholarly dishonest. It doesn't offer you any kind of interpretation of any kind of thing. It just becomes mantras that you use easily to claim you understand something. And this is important. You're going to get the PowerPoint so then you can read it slowly. He would say there's a trick that happens in the disparity discourse. And the disparity discourse, we all know, because the disparity discourse is a discourse that says how much percent is here, how much percent is there. During the corona pandemic, the earliest months of it, there was an article that came out that in the US, black and brown persons were more susceptible to corona. And he said they used the disparity discourse. They said black and brown people are more susceptible. He said they never asked which black and brown people. He said, I was not susceptible to it. I supposedly belong to that category, but I was not susceptible to it. And many people who belong to that 1/3 of American middle class, African American middle class, were not that susceptible to corona. So the disparity discourse is a discourse of statistics. And his argument is that what it does is you see something that's going wrong, that's a disparity discourse, and you say its cause is its effect. Its cause can't be its effect. So an outcome, you see that more people are susceptible to corona, and what you say then immediately, it is race. And he says the moment you say it is race is the moment you haven't really looked at what's going on. You should look specifically. And it seems sufficient, as he would say, if one has already stacked the interpretive deck in favor of a particular causal account. Because you've built it this way, that's what you see. I'm going to read this quote because I think this quote explains it clearly. Put another way, if you go looking for racial effects in data of how many people are infected, data sets that are organized by race as gross categories, you will likely to find them. So if you create it and you say blacks, whites, browns, and you're looking for racial effects, you'll find it because you've already created it this way. But that will not necessarily lead to sound interpretations of the factors that actually produce the inequalities. So he's making the same argument continuously throughout the article. Be specific, pay attention, look at what is really going on. And this is the last quote. He would say, and remember Adolf Reed, that's interesting because he partially went into the Black Power movement, but he said, what was Black Power now actually about? And he said Black Power was about getting a particular group of already well-educated into positions of authority and power. It was not a mass movement for everyone. It was only a set group that would enter. That is diversity and inclusion, according to Adolf Reed nowadays. So when he called it a Bookerite politics of elite brokerage, he means Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was an American thinker, organizer, university, and so forth. And what Booker T. Washington said, we should not rebel. We should create an elite, and that elite will then lead the people. And he's saying much of that Black Power is doing the same. It's saying we need representation in politics, in industry, and all these things. And these representatives will then lead us. But he's saying that means the vast majority will never climb. And that means you will always need the elite to help you. And it doesn't matter what color the elite is, you will always need the elite to help you. And the elites will participate with, or will cooperate with one another. And what gets rendered invisible when you talk about the black poor, he says, then you're not talking about nurses, you're not talking about electricians, you're not talking about domestic helps, you're not talking about, because you're not seeing anything anymore. When you create these big categories, then you can't solve anything, because trying to solve something for electricians is not the same as trying to solve it for nurses. It's not the same as trying to solve it for, I don't know, lawyers and so forth, or students or non-students. So his argument is keep it specific. And keep it specific. That's his argument. At the end, that is the critique he offers in relation to Afro-pessimism and black nationalism. That none of them really look, and they make blacks invisible because they don't really see what's going on. And they create a gigantic category of white, and therefore they make that also invisible because they can't see that group either. This is Adolf Reed's argument in a nutshell. Questions, comments about Adolf Reed?
Yeah, since you said that, so he poses a critique on critical race theory, and to that theory belongs the theory of intersectionalism. Does he also poses a critique on intersectionalism?
Yeah.
Okay.
His critique of intersectionality is, he says, all intersectionality does is it pluralizes in the big chunks that we already know. So if you first were focusing on class, intersectionality will say it's not only class, it's also gender, it's also race, it's also, I don't know, ethnicity and so forth. And he will say, but why stop at these big categories? Why not actually make it more specific? If you want to talk, for instance, one of his arguments is that intersectional theorists will say we have to look at people who are not only women, but also black. And he will say, why only woman and also black? Why not woman, black, Latina, a particular class, living in a particular place, making so much money, and so forth. So he says intersectionality usually only keeps the big categories that everyone knows: race, gender, class, ethnicity, perhaps religion. Those are it, and therefore you don't see anything else either. And it presupposes, that's its second argument, that each of these categories have a particular normative value. So he would say, I'm an African American who descends from people who actually had education and some means of making it. But in the category of intersectionality, if you mention woman and black, it automatically means less. But he's saying it doesn't necessarily have to mean less. So it takes certain, it loads the categories in a certain way. And he doesn't want to load the categories in that certain way. He wants to continuously, as a Marxist, look specifically at what is going on, which situation in time and space, who are the people, what's happening, and then make an intervention. Yeah. He doesn't necessarily want to stay away from a structural, but he would say the structural comes after you've looked carefully, after you've done the study carefully, then you can make the structural analysis. and the structural analysis in a particular time and space. Yes.
So, like, how do you suggest that we study race? Like, how can you start super specific when there's so many groups?
The question is, how can you study then race if it is if you're going to do it specifically because it's so super diverse? How do you make a structural argument in relation to race? Partially, he's making a structural argument. He says he's going to look specifically at the discourses and where they're coming from, and he will say those discourses that speak about disparity, they're coming actually from a middle class that actually want a particular position in the liberal order, the neoliberal order. So then he makes he looks specifically, and then he makes a structural argument that this is what he sees. And he would then say, they put race first. He would not put race first, because he would then say, but that leaves out a whole lot of people for whom that is not the most important thing, why they're not climbing the social ladder. It might have to do with just simply that there's not enough books in the house. It might be that there's a food desert, as they call it in the US. There's not enough supermarkets there where kids can get nutrients. So it's not that per se. But he would say that group makes it only that. It's his argument. Yeah.
Why is it that it's harder for a black person than for a white person?
That's the question that he would pose, and he would say he's not sure if that's the case. Because he would say in the statistical disparity discourse, yes, but statistics creates two big categories, and it doesn't look specifically. Not all people that are white have it easier in the US. And he would then present other statistics to show how the vast majority in the Midwest, I believe he says, are struggling. So to tell those people, you have it better than everyone else, he would say that doesn't make any sense. Only in the disparity discourse does it make sense. And then he would say those people that voted for Trump and that people say they are the white working class that are racist, he would say they forget that many of those people voted twice for Obama, and they also voted for, what's his guy name? The one who didn't make it. Not Biden, Sanders. And they also voted for Sanders. But they voted also for Trump. So he would say, are they then racist? In what sense do you understand their reality if they voted twice for Obama, once for Sanders, and now for Trump? You need to look specifically to understand what is going on with them. But you can't just say the white working class simply votes for Trump and votes for white supremacy. That's his argument. What do we think of it? And I'm sorry, people, we're going over time. Yes.
So I try to compare with the situation right now. So there was one research in that people apply for jobs with an anonymous resume. And when the names and the pictures weren't there, the people with the same qualifications that hired more output than the names were there. So it wasn't like, so there you could see there was a bias when hiring people. I don't say racism exactly, but it was a bias that people were hired with their names on their resume, but on the anonymous one. So for me, I'll take that research as one of the examples that is sometimes, yes, it's more than a lot of race, but sometimes there's a lot of evidence that it's sometimes it is.
around it. And if you have the same qualities, the same requirements, the same, like the description, you still don't get the same chances as a person that's non-colored, non-white, person has.
So let me just repeat for the audience at home. What the student just says is, yes, but there are all types of experiments, social experiments that show that if someone has to get a job and if the resumes are blind, then you notice that they just choose the best person. But when surnames and so forth are added to it, then you recognize that they choose surnames and pictures, photos. Then you notice that they choose the candidate with a Dutch name and a pinkish skinned complexion. White complexion is, I don't think people can be white, but white in the political sense of the word. That's a good argument. And what is that argument saying about the argument that Reed is making? Just like we did with Bilderson. What's Reed's trick? Now I'm going to give the microphone because I think this is easy. What's Reed's trick?
I'm not entirely sure, but I would say Reed is a materialist, so he does not really take into account that there might be like ideologies that keep people in place. For example, like as race, as a concept that is not only prospering as like making differences, but also in a sense that there are certain stereotypes that come with it and that people have and that they're continuing, although you might not see them directly materially.
I think his focus is on building solidarity between as large a group as possible, which is why he doesn't look at some of the specific ideologies that can be divisive. So his focus is more on saying, what are the problems that we face together in the current world system? And I think if you asked him about specific racial issues, he would agree. Also, I'd heard of Adolf Reed before, but hadn't read of anything because in identity politics at the minute, he is literally cancelled. He's had speaking engagement cancelled for the last maybe 2 years for the same reasons of people being concerned he's not addressing race in the right way. And his point is more to build solidarity between as broad a leftist base as possible to create transformation.
Correct. So if you look at Reed's trick, what he does is he helps us forget a category called racecraft. Just like you have witchcraft, you have racecraft. Racecraft is a particular kind of enchantment in which the vast majority of the world, almost all of us, we can't see each other nor think about each other outside of racial categories. We find it impossible. If someone says, I don't see race, I don't see color, we say, what the hell are you talking about? Of course you see it. When we say that, we're talking about racecraft. It is that which permeates, going back again to Gilroy, one of those things that we were bequeathed due to modernity. This way of understanding ourselves and understanding each other. If racecraft exists, that means that it cannot only be the specifics of a situation. There will be some trans-specific or trans-contextual mechanisms that enter every specific situation. And that trans-contextual mechanism is racecraft, is the idea that enters our minds when we see each other and we say black, white, brown, Surinamese, Moroccan, etc., etc. And you notice he doesn't address that. And she's right. Why doesn't he address it? Because he's of the opinion, like what Marxists think, if people find a situation that all of them are suffering from, if they start to work together, they will forget the racecraft. They will become disenchanted from it. That's his hope. So if he focuses on it, he would say, then you're never going to get the people together. So you have to focus on something that binds them. Then you get them together, and then they fight for that, and then they think, you know, it doesn't really matter if we're different ethnicities because this is what matters. That's the trick he's trying to play. And indeed, he's been canceled because people say, you're not talking about that. And he's saying, of course, racism exists, but that's not really the most important thing. The most important thing is that the people in the Midwest and the people in certain areas of the South, both of them are suffering the same situation. The people in Detroit are suffering the same situation, and those people have to unite to actually get their due. And if they unite, then they'll recognize that the things that they thought divided them are not so important. Yes. He does recognize that such a thing exists, but in this article, he's not going to foreground it. He never really foregrounds it, because foregrounding it would enable it to keep dividing people.
Yeah, so it's like, if I don't mention that racecraft exists, people will not put an emphasis on the differences and they will forget it. So that then racecraft will also disappear.
It will become less, we will be less enchanted by it, yeah. Less or not enchanted by it, yeah. But how you talk matters, because Reed would say, we are talking creatures, and the way we talk about race and racism enables it. So find different ways of talking about the inequalities that exist. So he's translating them into something else. No Marxist says racism does not exist. But what Marxists will say, they will say it is secondary. It's a modality of class. That's exactly what Reed does. So in a way, he's very faithful to the Marxist discourse. If there are no other questions, let's have a drink. Are there other questions or comments? Yes.
In what way does his argument differ from Gilroy's argument?
Remember that Gilroy is less inclined to connect the Black Atlantic paradigm with Marxism. And Reed and Gilroy is focusing on race and racism. Reed is more, we would recognize, yes, race is there, racism is there, but he would say, let's focus on class. Where's your class analysis, Gilroy? I don't see your class analysis.
Why was Wilderson against feminism? You mentioned that before.
Again, it's a question of nuance. Wilderson is not against feminism. He is also on record pro-LGBT rights and so forth. But he's saying this is not the fundamental matter. He's saying feminists say patriarchy is the fundamental matter. Marxists say labor is the fundamental matter. And I say, no, it's anti-blackness is the fundamental matter. So yes, people who are black experience sexism and so forth, but that's not the fundamental matter. So it's what they consider fundamental and what they consider secondary. And you see with Reed, yes, it's important, but it's secondary. And he would say, yes, class is important, but it's secondary. And some feminists would say, yes, class is important, and yes, racism is important, but gender is primary. No other questions? I will let, I forgot your name, but we know each other. I will let you have the last word. Could you give her the microphone? You can have the last word. I can have the last word.
Nou,
En
ja? Het doet me... Hoor je me? Ja. Ik vind het prettig om tussen studenten te zijn. Ben ik gewend hoor. Tussen jonge mensen en zo. Ik voel niet dat ik mijn leeftijd. En we kunnen zo prettig met elkaar praten. En een van ze heeft mij geïnterviewd. Ik heb haar... straks gaan we verder ermee. Dat vind ik leuk. Omdat ik over racisme in Amsterdam. Ik ben heel actief geweest in de jaren 80, 85, 90. Dus ik weet er een beetje over. En ik heb haar een paar tips gegeven. Ja. Er was ook een platform hier in Amsterdam. Heel veel mensen weten dat niet. En Amsterdamse platform, zoiets. Ja, is lang geleden. Dus, ja. Nee, maar ik ben... Francio heb ik in Leiden leren kennen. Weet je, Carabistiek. Ik weet niet meer in welk jaar dat was in Leiden. En ook bij Norman, een elektronstraat denk ik, heb je ook een workshop of training gegeven. Dus vandaar die belangstelling is zo. Ik heb nu de gelegenheid gekregen. Ik vind gewoon, als je tijd hebt, moet je het benutten. Dat was het.
Yes, thank you, Radio Mart, for having us here. And one student is creating a piece of art, and she will deliver that piece of art the moment it's... could you perhaps explain what the piece of art is? And then it will be placed here as a reminder, a symbol of the University of Amsterdam being here.
So I'm making a ceramic piece in relation to the BLM and this visit as well. It's kind of in process, but it will take a couple of weeks because it has to be fired twice because of the ceramic process. But I thought it'd be nice to make something that comes back to the place of the classes as well.
Thank you, and we're going to stop. Next week we're back at the university. There will be no food and drinks then. Okay, bye-bye.